Thank you, everyone, for joining us here this afternoon for our talk with Dr. Faith Hillis from the University of Chicago. I see people are trickling in from the waiting room. So before I get started, I just wanted to make a few announcements. First of all, we have some great events coming up. On November 1st, we have a brown bag talk on tragic January protests in Kazakhstan by our visiting scholar, Christopher White. We have a Ukrainian pirozhki cooking class on November 8th. And we have acclaimed Ukrainian poet Lyuba Yakimchuk speaking and doing a reading downtown Lawrence in the Cider Gallery on November 6th. The talk today is part of our Reframe series, where we're inviting scholars who are doing some of the most path-breaking and innovative research in our field. In some cases, in light of the ongoing war in Ukraine, in some cases in response to longstanding questions in the field that have been little examined, or new perspectives on longstanding issues. So I'm really happy to welcome Faith Hillis here for this series to talk about her award-winning book. And I want to thank the work that Ezra Pradalotz and Megan Luttrell did on the CREASE team to make this talk possible. Professor Hillis is professor of Russian history at the University of Chicago. She is the author of Children of Rus, Right Bank Ukraine and the Invention of Russian Nation. She's held fellowships at the Dorothy and Louis B. Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library, at Columbia University, and Harvard University. And her research has been funded by the American Council of Learned Societies, Fulbright Hays, and the National Endowment for the Humanities, among others. I've known Faith since my graduate student days at Berkeley, and I really enjoyed watching her scholarship grow and expand in new directions, including into the realm of digital history and into the international and global dimensions of Russian and East European history. Her book, Utopia's Discontents, Russian Émigrés and the Quest for Freedom, 1830s to the 1930s, takes that turn, looking at a global history of the Russian Revolution, a long revolution that includes the ways in which this revolution developed in places like London and Paris. She looks at the revolution as the continuation of a decades-long conversation that began in emigration, was exported back to Russia, and how Russian émigré communities developed into revolutionary social experiments in diaspora, and how their efforts to transform the world played crucial roles not only in socialism, but also liberalism, anarchism, and Zionism. Published by Oxford University Press, Utopia's Discontents recently won the 2022 Wayne S. Vucinich Prize for the most important contribution to Russian, Eurasian, and East European studies in any discipline of the humanities or social sciences. And so we're really delighted to have Faith here to talk about this book. She will speak for about 45 minutes or so. Then we'll have time for questions. If you have questions, please put them in the chat or use the raise hand or Q&A function. Use the Q&A or the chat function if you have questions. And I will also put in the chat a link to her book if you'd like to pick up a copy, which I highly recommend. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to Faith.
Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation. I appreciate Ezra's efforts and everyone else who helped me get here to Kansas virtually. I'm going to share a PowerPoint, and it'll be our companion, as it were, while we talk. Let me just put this in presenter view. Okay, hopefully everyone can see a large picture now, the book cover. All right. The future of humanity depended on this Geneva brasserie. Or so it seemed, at least to the young people from Russia who populated the Café Landau in the summer of 1903. In a back room, Vladimir Lenin gathered with comrades to build a new Marxist party. And meanwhile, up front, Chaim Weizmann, the future first president of Israel, met with friends to lay plans for a Zionist university that would cultivate the national potential of the Jewish people. The Landau stood at the very heart of Geneva's so-called Russian colony, a boisterous community of exiles that included professional revolutionaries representing every leftist party, as well as nationalists of every stripe from the Russian Empire, not only Zionists, but also Poles, Armenians, Ukrainians, and others. Russian colonies in Geneva and other European cities sheltered several generations of activists and produced most of the illegal literature that circulated in Russia. These were sites where Russians discovered socialism, anarchism, and Marxism, and where Bolshevism was born. But the utter dominance of a very traditional brand of intellectual history means that in approaching these questions means that until recently, we've known very little about the lives of the people who actually lived in these places. Why did Lenin, a Russian Marxist raised on the Volga River, and Weizmann, a Jewish nationalist from Belarus, convene in the same cafe thousands of miles from their respective homes? And what were the results of the encounters that occurred in the Café Landau and other places like it? These are the central questions of my book, which produces the first synthetic account of radical exile life over the last years of the Tsarist regime. I argue that the Russian colonies should be seen as utopian communities whose improvised nature allowed residents to build the world that they wanted to see. And I want to emphasize from the beginning that when I'm talking about utopianism here, I'm not suggesting that utopia is quixotic or impossible. And in fact, quite the contrary, following the Marxist theorist Ernst Bloch, I'm interested in thinking through the ways that the dream of a perfect world becomes inscribed in praxis through daily community life. So I show how colony life afforded émigrés the opportunities to liberate themselves from the bonds that had oppressed them in Russia, and to evolve from merely dreaming about the revolution to actually living the revolution. It turns out that through living revolutionary lifestyles and creating revolutionary communities abroad, émigrés actually managed to prefigure the very world of which they dreamed to bring it to life. So this is an argument that's trying to broaden the purview of intellectual history, to think about lived experience as a vital part of intellectual production. This project is very much about space and place. And as I'll argue, the particular demographics of these émigré colonies, their spatial arrangement, and the contacts that they catalyzed all define their revolutionary potential. But at the same time, the forms of radical praxis that emerged from these spaces traveled far beyond their borders. So I'll show how experiments born in the colonies made it back to Russia, and I'll identify several critical junctures at which developments abroad played an important role in forging radical thought in the country that the émigrés had left behind. In addition to providing this properly transnational account of the Russian Revolution, this book yields new insights into the entanglements between autocratic Russia and liberal Europe. As we'll see, the colonies left surprising marks on their host societies. Above all, this book is an argument for the generative power of the émigré milieu. But it also shows how the revolutionary visions articulated in the colonies evolved in unexpected and often troubling ways. Ultimately, the colonies produced deep discontents, this is the discontents of the title, that shaped revolutionary culture no less profoundly than their utopian ambitions. So I'm going to start by examining how colony residents lived the revolution, what this meant to them. I'm then going to consider their influence in moving these politics that they create across borders. And then I'm going to close by thinking about the unanticipated results of their experiments and their impact on the Russian Revolution and the early Soviet experience. Space and demography both played key roles in defining the utopian potential of the Russian colonies. And I spent a lot of time trying to examine and reconstruct this using digital techniques. There's very little reliable population data about who lived in the colonies and when, but one way that I determined I could gauge their relative importance and their evolution was by looking at their literary output. By the early 20th century, there were Russian colonies in almost every country of Europe, as you can see here, but the most significant centers were in England, France, and Switzerland, which served as my central archival case studies. Russians flocked to these countries because they offered the most extensive political rights. And in fact, almost all Tsarist subjects, regardless of the reasons they found themselves abroad, were classified as refugees. Émigré settlements tended to emerge on in inexpensive neighborhoods on the urban periphery. Paris's Russian colony, the biggest in Europe, coalesced in the 13th arrondissement around Les Gobelins. In Geneva, we're talking about the southern edge of the city leading out to the suburb of Carouge. And in London, Russian émigrés initially clustered around the British Library, which was a favorite hangout of revolutionaries the world over. Groups that had been especially disadvantaged in Russia disproportionately flocked to the colonies, and they used the freedom of these spaces to liberate themselves abroad. These communities were run by professional revolutionaries who emerged as their moral consciences of sort. But they were also full of self-professed emancipated women who pursued university study abroad, and many end up becoming radicalized in their studies overseas. Finally, it's important to note that the colonies were majority minority. And I mean by that, they were disproportionately and mostly populated by Poles, Ukrainians, Georgians, Armenians, and Jews. So I want to be clear that when I'm using the term Russian, I don't mean ethnic Russian. I mean of the Russian Empire and people who are often using Russian as a lingua franca to speak to one another, regardless of whether it's their first language. Now, all of these groups, women, revolutionaries, and national minorities, used the freedom of the colonies to pursue political programs. These were intense sites of political agitation and organizing. But what was most interesting to me was how the social infrastructure of these places not only articulated, but actually realized their values. Colony residents built dense networks of communities, revolutionary courts, mechanisms to redistribute wealth, self-governance institutions, all built around the principles of justice and equality. They also founded dense networks of clubs, coffee houses, libraries, canteens, and a lively periodical press. These institutions, which aspired to serve all colony residents despite their varied origins, catalyzed new encounters between men and women from different walks of life. They encouraged residents to build new friendships, solidarities, and to contemplate the ways in which their own individual hopes and dreams could in fact be connected. So to give you examples of this, national minorities in exile, yes, they pursued freedom for their own people, but they also began to explore together radical alternatives to imperial rule altogether. This included many federalist schemes. Similarly, the projects pursued by those emancipated women was not a narrow project of equal rights. It tended rather to be a project to revolutionize the social order by practicing free love and smashing barriers between ethnicities and classes. The overarching ethos of these new solidarities was to give voice to the persecuted, to uplift the dispossessed, and to create a society that revolved around them. To look at the dynamics of how all of this worked in practice, I want to focus on an emancipatory campaign that I argue was especially generative in these émigré communities, and that is the campaign for Jewish emancipation. Some 60 to 80% of colony residents were Jewish, and this is precisely because Jews faced such intense repression in the Russian Empire. Resolving the so-called Jewish question became one of the most urgent questions of colony life. And in fact, my account really places this question at the center of Russian revolutionary history. But of course, from the beginning, there was huge disagreement about how to accomplish this goal. Some residents of Jewish origin gravitated to Marxism. They included Pavel Axelrod and Rosa Luxemburg, both early and influential Marxist theorists. Stringent universalists, Marxists insisted that the liberation of any specific group ran by way of social revolution. As Axelrod put it, quote, "There is no Jewish question, only the social question." Zionism, by contrast, saw particularism rather than universalism as a solution to the Jewish question. And it also flourished in the hothouse of the colonies. Zionists waged fierce debates with Marxists at student pubs, at public gatherings, one at which speakers competed for the loyalty of students in the Swiss city of Bern stretched over 60 nights. But amidst this history of enmity and competition also lurks one of interconnection. In fact, several major Zionists who were not Marxists, and of course there are also Marxist Zionists, so the landscape is even more complicated than I'm suggesting, several major Zionists, including Weizmann and Vladimir Jabotinsky, talk about how it was their encounters with Jewish Marxists in these émigré milieus that consolidated their national convictions. So I'm arguing that these ideologies that may seem in competition or mutually exclusive were actually mutually constitutive in these small spaces. Encounters that occurred in the colonies also played a crucial role in shaping a third political alternative that moved between these poles, and this is one that I might call Jewish socialism. This path was pioneered by a now obscure figure named Aaron Lieberman. A former rabbinical student from Vilna, Lieberman fell in with a group that revolved around the Russian socialist Pyotr Lavrov in the 1870s. This happened in London. Lieberman challenged long traditions of anti-Semitism and Russian radicalism, urging Russian socialists to engage more with Jewish issues and to recruit more Jews into their movement. Indeed, he argued that Jews were the most oppressed people of the Russian Empire, oppressed by virtue of their religion, their ethnicity, and their class. He contended that Jews, therefore, could be the ideal revolutionaries. As these debates continued, a new wave of migration began that transformed the nature of all of these arguments. And here I return to the importance of lived experience. In the 1880s, Jewish proletarians began to flee Russia en masse. In contrast to those czarist subjects who had already settled abroad, most of these new travelers were not intellectuals with university educations. Instead, they were religious, Yiddish-speaking residents of the Pale of Settlement. Most, if you would ask them, would not even necessarily have identified with Russia or the Russian Empire, but rather with their region or city of origin. In the midst of this violence, tens of thousands settle in London and Paris, where most find work in the artisanal trades or in sweatshops. And although these cities hosted large contingents of émigrés, the newcomers tended not to settle there, and this is yet another sign of their distinctiveness. Instead, they gravitated to neighborhoods with reputations of being Jewish spaces. These included the East End in London and the Marais in Paris. Aaron Lieberman, who had already committed himself to engaging Jews in the revolutionary movement, immediately gravitated to the proletarians who had now settled in his adopted home city of London. And his encounters with them there encouraged his brand of Jewish socialism to evolve in new directions. He observed that Jewish workers who had suffered from poverty and persecution in Russia were now experiencing new forms of exploitation at the hands of developed capitalism in the West. According to Lieberman, this experience of universal persecution across so many different national contexts made Russian Jewish proletarians ideally suited to lead a truly global struggle for the emancipation of all people. Lieberman thus argued that the particular suffering of Jewish workers could and must be harnessed in pursuit of the broader cause of liberating all mankind. And this insight into how the particular could inform the universal encouraged him to use a new tactic, conducting political agitation in Yiddish. This was a deeply unconventional move for someone from Russia, since most radical intellectuals, whether Jewish or not, viewed Yiddish as a jargon unbefitted to discussing the important world of high politics. In London, Lieberman succeeded in organizing the world's first Yiddish-speaking workers' union. And by the 1880s, young Jewish intellectuals inspired by his work flooded into the East End, creating the world's first Yiddish radical newspapers and a series of clubs and reading rooms that supported them. And here you see pictured the most famous of these clubs, the Berners Street Club in East London. These institutions carried on the task of translating the concerns of Russian revolutionaries to Jewish workers, both literally and metaphorically. Revolutionaries hired unemployed workers to translate the Russian revolutionary classics into Yiddish. So this is the literal element of translation. And on the metaphorical level, radicals encouraged the immigrant workforce to see the revolutionary politics of the colonies as the solution to their everyday travails. So here's an example of this, one of these Yiddish radical newspapers explaining to workers the importance of the Paris Commune and why the answers posed by the Paris Commune were also the answers to their labor problems. By the late 80s, these organizing efforts yielded their first fruit. Yiddish-speaking labor unions in London staged their first successful strike against employers. The revolutionary movement coalescing in London was the product of encounters between professional revolutionaries and Jewish proletarians that crossed class and linguistic boundaries. It harnessed particular experiences of Jews and their cultural traditions in the service of the emancipation of mankind via the Marxist liberation of labor. Word of these accomplishments, as well as the publications produced in London, rapidly circulated around the world. London organizers were in close contact with activists in New York and Paris, constantly moving between these cities, and they exported tactics as well as publications. And here you'll see this is the same kind of data I pulled on before, looking at the number of publications produced abroad. And you'll see that Yiddish, here denoted in yellow, becomes a very important part of the revolutionary literary sphere, particularly in London. The rapprochement between Jewish proletarians and Russified intellectuals was extremely consequential for all segments of the emigration. Marxists as well as non-Marxist parties, and these included socialist revolutionaries, anarchists, and many others, began to move into Jewish districts to found their own Yiddish language newspapers, clubs, so on and so forth. And here's a picture of some Jewish revolutionaries in the Bahai. Gradually, proletarian Jews who had been so dispossessed in their homeland became vital participants and even leaders of the Russian revolutionary movement. I found astonishing examples in the archives of sweated workers in London and Paris appearing at mass meetings and proclaiming their willingness to return to Russia and to die for the revolutionary cause. In essence, I'm arguing proletarian Jews became Russified and integrated into this revolutionary diaspora abroad. In the process, the nature of émigré neighborhoods themselves began to change. In London, the traditionally Jewish neighborhood of the East End became the new center for Russian radical life, drawing in Gentiles as well as Jews. And for many, this kind of spatial fusion was the greatest sign yet of the promise of émigrés to overcome all of these divisions, linguistic, ethnic, class, and to join men and women from the Russian Empire and from the world in common cause. Now, the politics that emerged from the colonies were very much tied to this dense space they occupied and the particular encounters that they catalyzed between their residents. But they also had profound effects on the world beyond their borders. And I'm moving now to the second part of the talk that focuses on these exchanges. Although émigré settlements were isolated and far-flung, the circulation of texts and people between them knitted them into a kind of communicative space. Libraries in different cities exchanged texts. Mutual aid organizations emerged that spoke for the emigration as a whole. Meanwhile, colony residents maintained contact with Russia through intricate smuggling networks that they established. They spirited tens of thousands of illegal publications into the empire each year, and tens of thousands of dissidents out. And here I've mapped some of these routes described in memoirs going in and out. So colony residents here are not merely imagining this world without borders or dreaming of it, they're actually constructing it and living it. Already in the 70s and 80s, these networks were having a profound effect on Russian radicalism. And in the book, I connect this foreign organizing to the birth of the populist movement. I'm happy to say more about that in the Q&A. But of all the movements created abroad, it was this unique brand of Yiddish socialism that emerged in the East End that had the most profound impact on Russia of all. In the 1890s, the city of Vilna gave rise to a new socialist movement infused by a democratic spirit, and this eventually evolves into the Jewish Labor Bund, the first organized Marxist party in Russia. The foundation of the Bund is usually told as a domestic story, but I argue that the émigré publications and returned activists played a key role in this process. The Bund quickly became the largest party in Russia, and for a few years even served as the motive force of Russian Marxism. Indeed, in 1898, Bund activists played a leading role in the creation of the Social Democratic Workers' Party, the first all-imperial Marxist party. So the colony's knack for harnessing the particular in service of the universal is once again in clear view here. We see how a culture that comes out of a very particular émigré setting has broader import, how Jewish socialism developed abroad eventually is imported into Russia, becoming a constitutive element of Russian Marxism. The colonies' reputation for living the revolution also had profound effects on their European host societies. Russian émigrés were participants in almost all of the freedom struggles of the 19th century. It is well known that Russians and people from the Russian Empire played important roles in the creation of the international left and the creation of the Second International. But it is less well known that they mingled with Irish, Persian, and Indian nationalists living in European exile, who came to see these émigrés as heroes in the struggle of subalterns against exploitative imperial powers. In the book, I trace how each of these movements drew on the inspiration of and the insights of the Russians. Russians played a crucial role in the struggle for women's rights as well. There were very strong connections between the British suffragettes, who got the idea of the hunger strike, it seems, from the Russians, who had pioneered this in the Siberian labor camps. Interestingly, the international left, these anti-colonial movements mingling with people from the Russian Empire, and feminists all paid very special attention to the accomplishments of Russian Jewish revolutionaries. So again, we have not only this internal dynamic of Jewish emancipation happening, but also external people watching this and being impressed. So these relationships between Russians and foreigners engaged in their own struggles for freedom added to this utopian spirit of the colonies. They enhanced the colonies' reputation as spaces in which the powerless could create new societies and define their own terms of living. But the power of these lived utopias also proved extremely facile. And that's because the very elements that imbued these communities with revolutionary promise also undermined their potential. The intimacy and solidarity of colony life bred devastating conflicts that often married ideology and personal jealousies. They also facilitated the work of the Russian secret police, or the Okhrana, which had completely infiltrated these communities with informants and double agents by the 1880s. In the late 1880s, the Okhrana launched a new kind of attack against the immigration. And this was one that aimed to defame émigrés' reputations in an effort to corrode the sympathy that they enjoyed in Europe and the protections that they had been granted as refugees. Police agents established a press agency that paid off newspaper editors to publish articles and embedded Okhrana employees in prominent Western outlets. The parallel here to contemporary fake news endeavors is quite extraordinary. This press agency also produced dozens of articles and pamphlets of its own aimed at Western audiences, a few of which you see here. Finally, the police engaged in a series of provocations intended to produce panic about the criminal intent of émigrés. And they went so far as to actually organize bombings and assassination campaigns in Europe that they managed to pin on these radical émigrés. Anti-Semitic conspiracy theories were a crucial part of this campaign against the immigration. For example, when Jack the Ripper began terrorizing East London in 1888, Okhrana publicists gleefully insisted that the killer was a deranged Russian Jewish anarchist. It, of course, didn't help that the body of one of the Ripper's victims was found outside the Burner Street Club, which I showed you earlier, on the very night that its Russian Jewish members had gathered for a mass meeting about the promise of socialism. Stories like these, repeated ad nauseum, were picked up by British and by Western sources, which began to produce images like these, again, suggesting a kind of fusion of fear about the Ripper and these kind of classically anti-Semitic features. So I'm suggesting here that the Tsarist secret police are cannily finding a way to turn the colony's struggle for Jewish emancipation and their accomplishments in this sphere into an Achilles heel. Police meddling, which was reinforced by effective lobbying and press interventions, had a consequential impact on transforming European perceptions of the immigration. As I've mentioned, Western opinions of Russians had been overwhelmingly positive early on, seeing the latter as long-suffering refugees. You have an image of this here, the beautiful feminine Switzerland saving the benighted refugees from the East. But by the 1890s, we began to see a starkly different image of these émigrés and what they mean to Europe. We began to see a panic about people from the Russian Empire as being terrorists. Or sometimes we see images portraying them as parties to a Jewish plot to destroy Christian society in Russia and in Europe. So we can see major attacks on émigré rights following this shift. The new external pressures that émigré society faced in the light of these changes intensified its internal discord. And unsurprisingly, the Jewish question emerged as the greatest thorn in the side of the immigration of all. I had argued that the invention of Jewish socialism and its promise to harness the traditional and particular in the service of the universal transformed colony life. But it also led to a blowback from stringent universalists among the ranks of Marxists, who argued, in essence, that Russian Marxism had become too Jewish. Many of the founding fathers of Russian Marxism accused the Bund of trying to hijack the movement to serve their own selfish interests. These accusations, which were informed by histories of radical anti-Semitism, were intensified by very deep personal jealousies engendered by the Bund's meteoric rise. Georgy Plekhanov, known to many as the father of Russian Marxism, for example, argued that the Bund, and I'm quoting here, was a band of exploiters who abuse Russians. And he insisted, still quoting, that the Russian Social Democratic Party should be Russian. Pavel Axelrod, himself Jewish by birth, warned his comrades to watch their pockets when dealing with the Jews of the Bund, internalizing the very anti-Semitic canards that undergirded the Okhrana's anti-Jewish propaganda. And bear in mind, all of these ad hominem attacks are coming from within the ranks of Marxists. And as you can imagine, the sort of disputes between Marxists and Zionists and other groups become even fiercer. These conflicts spread like wildfire in the close-knit colonies, destroying longtime relationships. And in the early 20th century, the combination of these deep internal rifts and also these new external pressures had taken a very heavy toll on these utopian spaces. Consequently, the mood in the colonies turned distinctly dystopian. At this point, we get Lenin, who arrives in Europe in 1900, having recently completed his term of Siberian exile. As we now know, he used his time abroad to embark on a wholesale renovation of Marxist theory, rejecting the Marxist orthodoxy that revolution would evolve out of social contradictions, and insisting that the revolution would need to be incited and guided by the conspiratorial actions of proven cadres. This entire turn of events is usually analyzed from the vantage point of the history of ideas. But Bolshevism, like previous radical movements, was profoundly shaped by the particularities of the émigré milieu. Lenin's new revolutionary doctrines responded to the very specific challenges that émigrés faced at the turn of the century. He took universalist Marxism to new extremes, scathingly rejecting the legitimacy of any discussion about the special needs of Jews or also women. He also blamed the disorder in the colonies on émigrés' tradition of freewheeling intimacy and their efforts to pursue emancipation from below. But even as he challenged august émigré traditions, he joined prior generations of colony residents in using the improvised space of exile to build a utopian community of his own. And in fact, I argue that it's really difficult to separate the ideology of Bolshevism from the lived experience, that again, they were more mutually constitutive. The Bolsheviks withdrew from the Geneva colony to form their own private district, very close to the central colony, but distinct. They ventured into the center of Russian Geneva only to conduct agitation. And Lenin used the secretive inner sanctum that he built to create the disciplined cadres of which he dreamed. The culture of this new Bolshevik community on the outskirts of Geneva was explicitly patriarchal. Lenin's followers described him as a wise and benevolent father who set the party's path and could mediate its internal disputes. And I think you see that here with Lenin represented, quite literally twice as large as anyone else in his party. Patriarchy was also reflected in Bolshevik culture. Although the first cohort, as you see, contains several married couples, women assumed crucial, but nevertheless traditionally feminine roles in the Bolshevik colony. They did things like manage the correspondence, cooking, and cook at the Bolshevik canteen. And this was a major retreat from the very public roles that women had assumed in the public culture of the colonies, appearing at conferences, giving speeches, so on and so forth. Finally, Bolshevik ideology was indelibly shaped by encounters with non-Bolshevik rivals encountered in the close quarters of these Russian neighborhoods. The Bolsheviks used the very intimate knowledge that they had of other émigrés acquired abroad to discredit them. So, for example, when Lenin is trying to attract followers in Geneva, he ends up compiling a dossier on the deviant sexual practices of Geneva's Mensheviks. I assume here he's referring to instances of homosexuality. And he takes this dossier around town, using it to court émigrés, trying to get them to join his team. He also, unsurprisingly, uses this very painful Jewish question as a wedge. He smeared the Mensheviks, who had by then broken off from him, as a Jewish party, noting that all but one of the Central Committee members were Jews. And he likewise smears the Bund as a party of self-interested petty traitors, once again, drawing on these anti-Semitic stereotypes. Lenin succeeded in transforming the culture of the colonies, but he left them more divided than ever before. His personal attacks and provocative denunciations produced utter chaos in these communities, leading to physical violence and the dissolution of friendships and even marriages. It was at this point, for example, that the Zionists, who had actually always acted in immigration within this larger Russian institutional framework, debating in émigré taverns, appearing at student meetings, they began to withdraw from the colonies and to form their own exclusive networks. Some, of course, at this point, go even further afield, moving to Palestine. Rather than being chastened by these rifts, Lenin encouraged them, even within his own party. Not only in the lead up to the Bolshevik-Menshevik split, but quite consistently, he preached that schism was necessary to purge the party of undercommitted activists and to realize its true revolutionary potential. The growing chaos abroad alarmed activists back in Russia. Having once regarded Geneva and Paris as, quote, the Mecca and Medina of revolutionary thought, they increasingly warned that émigré dysfunction imperiled the entire radical diaspora. In 1911, a young Russia-based Bolshevik named Stalin, one of the very few original Bolsheviks who did not spend substantial time in immigration, he vented his frustration on exactly this question. Revolutionary change, he insisted, would not be made by squabbling exiles, but rather by practical workers, as he called men in Russia like himself, those who were working and toiling under czarist rule and risking their lives every day. The utopian promise of the colonies appeared on the verge of extinction, and the pressures of World War I further accelerated this process of unraveling. I don't have time to say much about the war here, but I can address that later. But in March 1917, this rapid collapse was interrupted by utterly unanticipated events. Several weeks of protest in Russia and an army mutiny toppled the czarist regime, allowing tens of thousands of émigrés who had fled Russia to return home for the first time without the threat of arrest. When Lenin arrived at Petrograd's Finland station in April, he took his first step on Russian soil in more than a decade. But most of the high-ranking returnees who came back in 1917 had been away even longer. The Menshevik Plekhanov and the anarchist Kropotkin, for example, had left Russia in the 1870s. Throughout, I've been emphasizing the importance of milieu and the ways in which it structured revolutionary thought. But now, of course, these returned émigrés back in Russia found themselves in a completely different setting. They were no longer fighting for the loyalty of newly arrived exiles in cafes and libraries. Instead, they were fighting, quite literally, for control of the world's largest country. And they were also struggling to understand and grapple with the explosive mass politics that had been born of the revolution. In this new setting, most of the returnees became completely unmoored. Mensheviks, Bundists, SRs, anarchists, and even many Bolsheviks proceeded with caution and moderation, arguing that the time for utopian schemes had passed. But not Lenin. Without missing a beat, he embraced the chaotic power of the moment, trimming his sails to catch, as one eyewitness put it, the wild tumults of revolution. Historians still debate what allowed Lenin to navigate this completely unknown setting with such aplomb. Some argue that his ideological fervor, his ardent belief in a world that did not yet exist, carried the day. Others emphasize his supreme opportunism, the fact that he had this uncanny ability to take advantage of circumstances. My view is that it was actually the interaction between these two that was so important. The utopian spirit of immigration remained Lenin's lodestar, but in foreign exile, he had become attuned to how milieu shaped political possibility. A true creature of the colonies, he remained highly attuned to his surroundings and willing to adjust his course to meet their demands upon his return to Russia. The vision of the utopian future that Lenin peddled to Russians in 1917 was in large part informed by the experience of immigration. He explicitly discussed the communes, the practices of mutual aid, and the libraries built by émigrés as models for a new form of collective life. But at the same time, he overcame the self-limiting doctrinal squabbles of immigration, refraining from bringing the party to schism, even though he had done this multiple times in immigration. He worked to keep the dissidents who questioned his ideas in the party fold instead of casting them out. And I think he was able to do this because of the change of scene, because the nerve center of radical politics had moved from this incestuous émigré setting to this wide open canvas of revolutionary Russia. Lenin's understanding of the connections between this setting and possibilities also influenced his relationship to the other utopian visions that had emerged abroad. Although in immigration, he had vehemently denounced projects to emancipate Jews and women as particularist, he now became famous for his embrace of both. Ironically, these would become the Bolsheviks' marquee issues. Acknowledging the special struggles of female workers, the Bolsheviks created special party organizations and eventually a government bureaucracy to lead women to liberation. And similarly, they successfully co-opted the rich tradition of Jewish socialism, investing heavily in Yiddish language outreach and recruiting former Bundists to join the party, even authorizing special Jewish sections. The move from immigration to Russia allowed Lenin to free revolutionary politics of the limitations imposed by the émigré setting and to eradicate the scourge of doctrinalism from Bolshevik utopias. But the Bolsheviks faced another major challenge relating to their émigré past: how to manage their relationships with the ex-émigré rivals, mostly opposed to the Bolshevik state. The Bolsheviks immediately turned to repression. As early as January 1918, the party began to curtail Menshevik involvement in trade unions and to harass party activists. Meanwhile, even as they incorporated many of the Bunds' ideas and activists, they launched a brutal attack on the party's organizational structure, which was liquidated in 1920. And finally, although the Bolsheviks continued to pursue the cause of Jewish liberation under their own auspices for their own purposes, these racialized tropes of Jewish perfidy, which were a remnant of these émigré wars with the Bund, remained features of Bolshevik political culture. This is something that's recently been explored by Brendan McGeever and Andrew Sloan, among others. Historians have puzzled over the swiftness and brutality of this repression against fellow leftists. But I think that approaching these events through the framework of émigré history can help explain their logic. The animosity between the Bolsheviks and their left-wing rivals was not only political, it was personal. It was informed by decades of polemics, resentments, and history. Bolshevik violence against leftists was therefore driven by a desire to foreclose other revolutionary paths and to avoid the infighting and chaos that had plagued the radical intelligentsia abroad. As we know, the Bolsheviks eventually succeeded against the odds in building a revolutionary state and neutralizing their critics. Yet this accomplishment, like other achievements of colony life, brought its own unintended consequences. The triumph of the Bolsheviks necessarily mandated the transformation of the party's character. It became a mass party to which millions of peasants and workers flocked, overwhelming the founding base of émigré intellectuals and the intimate networks they had founded. This trend was accelerated by the meteoric rise of Stalin, who packed the party with his own loyalists, for the most part younger men who, like Stalin, had not lived abroad and had not been influenced by this émigré past. Already in the early 20s, there was a clear conflict within the Bolshevik Party between the alumni of the colonies and the younger, more plebeian activists who surrounded Stalin. In 1922, a circle of ex-émigrés, including several of the original Geneva Bolsheviks, founded the Society of Old Bolsheviks. This group considered itself the brains and the conscience of the party and strove to preserve the collective bonds of former émigrés. But already at its very first meeting, an incensed Stalin appeared, accusing the group of hoarding its cultural privilege. These conflicts intensified after Lenin's 1922 stroke and his death 2 years later, which instigated a full-fledged struggle for power in the party. A handful of oppositionists emerged to challenge Stalin's quest for power. All the leaders of these movements, I think not incidentally, were former émigrés: Trotsky, Kamenev, Zinoviev, and Bukharin. Stalin, for his part, continued to disparage the émigré clan and the myths that one-time émigrés had created around themselves. In an interview with a German journalist who asked Stalin whether he saw his lack of experience in Europe as a liability, Stalin peevishly responded, "Not at all." He went on to explain that while he had been fighting the tsarist regime in Russia, his émigré comrades had squandered their time in Paris and Geneva, drinking beer and fighting with each other over meaningless doctrinal issues. Stalin's struggle against the émigrés reached a fever pitch in the mid-30s. By that time, he had handily defeated this émigré-led opposition. He had disbanded the Society of Old Bolsheviks, and he had launched a series of show trials that implicated most of the original founders of the party in anti-regime conspiracies. Over and over, these trials turned the foreign connections of one-time émigrés against them, citing their contacts abroad as proof that they served foreign intelligence services. By the late 30s, almost all the old émigrés had been executed, immolated to the revolution to which they had devoted their entire lives. And here's an image, a very sad image of Grigor Zinoviev, one of the original Bolsheviks, shortly before he was executed. So how exactly should we understand Stalin's wrath? One victim of the purges speculated that Stalin saw the resilient strength of exile networks as incompatible with his vision of revolution. Our true crime, he wrote, and I'm quoting, lay simply in existing, in not disowning ourselves, in keeping our friendships and talking freely in one another's company. This quote poignantly captures a final unexpected outcome of the émigré experience. The strong bonds formed abroad had produced new political alternatives and social practices that transformed abstract revolutionary visions into lived reality. But the greatest accomplishment of the colonies is precisely what made their former residents a threat in Stalin's eyes. I think he feared quite rationally that émigré networks, which had once built an entirely new world abroad and then used this blueprint to refashion Russia, would return to Stalin's Russia and do so once again, toppling Stalin's regime and creating their own alternative. So I think this then is the final ultimate tragedy of the émigré experience. That the communal genius of the colonies and their utopian vision are precisely what colluded in the destruction of their former residents. Thank you. I'm going to stop the share and entertain questions and comments.
Great. Thank you so much, Faith, for that wonderful talk. And I really encourage everyone to pick up a copy of her book. We now have some time for questions, about 15 minutes. While those questions come in, I just wanted to start our discussion with one question. So I really liked how you brought a lot of different individuals to light, including some that are less well known and some that are more well known, like Stalin. Stalin was never in emigration, but of course he had his own experience of exile inside Russia, and in many ways, this experience evokes some of what you're talking about in terms of uprooting minority populations and moving them into new places in Russia, the sort of mixing of different groups in prisons and camps, and in exile, the smuggling networks. I'm wondering if you could juxtapose those two experiences, which do both involve uprooting mobility, living in close quarters in some cases, and sort of highlight some of the similarities and differences of that experience.
Right. Yeah, there are a lot of similarities and connections. And of course, as I was writing this, that was one of the things I was trying to figure out, the relationship between these two radical diasporas. Of course, as Lenin is sitting in Siberian exile, he's reading all of these émigré journals, all of these debates between the Bund and the Orthodox Marxists, and that's what is inspiring him to formulate his own response to this challenge. I think, though, the thing that really needs to be highlighted is the sort of the problem of freedom that runs through the émigré experience in Europe. No one in Siberia, even if they have limited freedoms because of being far away or being, the dysfunction of the czarist state and surveilling them, no one can sit in Siberia and say, aha, I'm finally here and I'm finally able to, study the revolutionary experience and build my new revolutionary movement. But you read so powerfully in these memoirs, when people arrive in Paris, for example, they say, I feel that I'm in the center of revolution and I have this whole revolutionary heritage here to read about and learn about. So I think this is really important in forging this utopian spirit, the idea that there's possibility. It's also really important just in the everyday practicalities of some of these movements. So, for example, the adoption of Marxism in Russia, again, is usually explained as a kind of like high intellectual history. The populists had worn themselves out and they were involved in all these fights. And so people began to look to new solutions, and Marxism was one of them. But if you look at the European context in which Marxism was adopted, it's very quotidian. I mean, these guys were in Zurich and they were observing meetings of German workers who were also living in exile in Zurich and were kind of amazed at the ways that they could organize themselves, and they were reading their journals. And so these contacts do really matter as people think about alternatives to the lives that they're living, whether they're liberal or radical or, of many flavors. So I think that the prospect of freedom is very important in this émigré experience. But the flip side of that is sort of what I was highlighting with Lenin, that you see this moment at the turn of the 20th century where the idealism with which many of these people arrived and the possibility that they believed was possible by virtue of living abroad begins to disappear in the face of this police interference, in the face of diminished émigré rights, and then just this infighting that's so chronic to these communities. So I think that also important in understanding Lenin's trajectory is understanding like this vaunted idea of freedom that exists, but then this experience of living abroad ends up actually not being what many of these émigrés hope and dream, and I think leads to this sort of darker turn that I see Lenin inaugurating. So I think that sort of trajectory is also important in the story, and it's something that again, you don't quite get when you're looking at Siberian exile communities.
Great, thanks. There's two questions that have come in the Q&A. I'll just read them quickly, and I think we can bundle them together. Sure. Just to leave time for other questions. The first is, were minority or Menshevik groups separated by the external forces, or did they unite thanks to these events? I'm thinking they're referring to the external forces of the Okhrana and their efforts to sort of divide the emigration. So did they band together? And the second question from John Vandevert asks about the role of popular culture in the popularization of émigré philosophy and radicalism. So you mentioned translated texts, but were there other forms, music, art, poetry? Are there records of these being weaponized and exploited in the pursuit of making these émigré networks?
Okay, I'll take the second question first. So I want to convey how lively and vibrant these communities where they really go beyond the text, right? The texts are important and are crucial actually to the story, but there's an entire culture surrounding the text that people are trying to put into motion. So one example that I'll mention is these Russian libraries that become, again, very important in terms of providing access to these revolutionary texts, but people actually talk about them as models for the revolutionary life that they want to live. And again, Lenin draws on this example in 1917, is very interested in reviving these institutions. So what this means is these institutions are democratically governed. They have, elections and a board. People talk about the very close relationships that they create in these settings. Many people discuss how they fall in love reading texts with other émigrés. That this is like this. There's almost a Talmudic practice of sort of like reading with a friend, and then you discuss and you talk, and often you fall in love with your friend. And people talked about this as not just a place where you go to read, but as a place where you go to form new communities. And so music is also part of that. There's radical theater that exists in these spaces. Art, that's really interesting. I haven't come across the question of art, but I would guess it was there. It's maybe just more ephemeral and hasn't been preserved. But these were really broad-ranging experiments. On the question of division or uniting, these debates are very complex, so it's tough to generalize. I guess what I'll say is one thing you see post 1905 or post 1900, when Lenin arrives, everything explodes. And essentially, most of the communities are united in the feeling, except for the Bolsheviks, that Lenin is a jerk, right? That Lenin is destroying things wherever he goes. And you see this, like he comes to Paris and a bomb goes off, and he goes to Zurich and everyone starts fighting. This is a real phenomenon. So people are unified, I think, in responding to that. But one of the big problems you see after 1905, and this goes back to that darker turn, that dystopian spirit, is although people may be able to agree on issues such as that, they can't agree on anything else. And what you see is these groups just losing coherence. Small factions are tearing each other apart. Again, friends are falling apart, marriages are falling apart. And that's one of the real tragedies, that there's just critique, and then Lenin sort of exploding the critique, and no one is able to build those institutions, or I think to formulate the dreams in the ways that the former generations had.
Great, thank you. One more question, if I can. You did a great job of weaving together this particularistic and universalistic strands, and particularly related to the Jewish radicals, and I understand a big critique from the Bolsheviks of this movement, whether they were too particularistic. But then I was surprised also you mentioned the patriarchal sort of qualities of the Bolsheviks. I'm wondering, where this came from, and is it and what is it responding to, and how do you explain it?
So it's important to say, because again, I think we think of the Bolsheviks and we think, oh, women's liberation, right? But that was something that developed much, much later. That was a project that the top Bolsheviks really only began exploring in 1913 in an embryonic form, but really it was a question of 1917. And I think it was a practical question of appealing to constituencies. What you see prior to that moment is, I think, so it all comes from Lenin. I mean, it's no exaggeration to say the Bolshevik Party really does spring from his imagination. And I think he's responding to precisely this kind of bottom-up practice of emancipation that he sees in the colonies, that previous generations think is very powerful and very meaningful, but Lenin, somewhat correctly, sees as a source of chaos. I've just discussed how these groups can't get it together, and they dream big, but that makes the stakes big. They're constantly fighting with each other, and this is part of the critique that he has when he comes in. And he's really quite explicit about this. He says to Martov, who loves hanging out in cafes and gossiping, he essentially says, you're going to be the death of our party. You can't do that. You can only talk to people about what you need to talk about when you need to talk about with them. And so I think this patriarchal spirit, which you see in the way that he treats the woman question, the idea that there is no separate woman question, the women are workers and they need to be treated as workers, period. I think that all goes along with the idea that the party is me, and I'm the one who sort of, I'm first of all in charge, and I'm second of all the one who gives orders. And this is what he's doing to Martov when he says we can't keep up these this kind of like consorting from below. We need to have this strict military discipline if we're going to win this, what he conceives of as a war.
Great, thank you. So in some ways, it's a rebellion against too much freedom.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's the wrong kind of freedom. I think he'd say you can only have freedom if it's the kind of freedom that I envision. Your kind of freedom is not freedom. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. Well, we're just about at 5 o'clock, so please join me virtually in thanking Professor Faith Hillis, for a wonderful talk. And I really encourage everyone to go pick up the book because there's a lot more, and a lot more great stories there. So thank you so much, Faith, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
We look forward to following your work in the years to come.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Bye.